Hello. This is Chris Nichols here, and I'm here to talk about the Garrett County that may have been and how a rainstorm and those scheming pens shrank Maryland's border. You can see here the spoiler of here's how big Garrett County could have been according to the original land grants, and here's what it ended up being. So we'll get into all those details in this presentation. I'm Chris Nichols, your guide today. I'm a local amateur historian. I make maps of the area, and I'm also a real estate agent in Garrett County. And hope you're interested in this and interested in seeing what Garrett County could have been. So let's jump into it. We kind of, on the East Coast, have a lot of weird looking states, and many of those are from grants that were provided by the King of England at the time to various lords and representatives to carve out colonies of England. And sometimes on purpose and sometimes due to ignorance of geography, these grants were conflicting or confusing or very vague. And often it was up to the grantees to maneuver and fight for and define the extent of their grants outside of what the king had originally had in mind. In the case of Maryland, if the confines of the original grant had been followed, the northern border would have been north of Philadelphia. All of the Delmarva Peninsula would have been Maryland, and the southern border could have moved about 50 miles further to the south and moving the western border about 8 miles to the west. Don't worry if that's a little confusing. We'll show a map in the next slide. But just looking at this original grant, in 1632, King Charles I granted to George Calvert, who is the first Lord Baltimore, this tract of land which would become the colony of Maryland. And the original charter was written in Latin and in very confusing text anyway, but generally the accepted version is that the border extends to the 40th parallel, that forms the northern border of Maryland. The southern border is formed by the Potomac River, and the western border is formed by a point of the first fountain of the Potomac. So that would be the headwaters, the wellspring, however you call it, the source of the Potomac River. You have that point, and you draw a line directly northward to the 40th parallel, and that forms the western border. So looking at this on the map, here is the current border of Maryland and the other surrounding states. Here is that 40th parallel that would have included Philadelphia had that been the northern border of Maryland. The southern border is the Potomac River here, and you see that in the light blue. And then interestingly, there's a north branch of the Potomac and a south branch. And in this case, what the north branch has become determined to be the branch of which the border is being formed. So you follow that up to its source, you draw a line straight north, and if that had been kept going to the 40th parallel, that would have been the border. As it is, the Mason-Dixon line is the northern border, and that is the western border of Maryland. Had the south branch of the Potomac been selected, following that to its headwaters, you have the westernmost point, you draw that line north. So all of this territory between the river and potentially the 40th parallel could have been in Maryland. And there was some controversies and things going on in the Delmarva Peninsula as well, but we're concerned with Garrett County here, so I'm not going to cover those in this presentation. You can go out to the Eastern Shore and talk to one of their historical societies and see what happened out here with Maryland and the Delmarva Peninsula. Just to give you a brief view of the timeline of all of these things, there were kind of negotiations and proceedings going on with both the northern and the southern border at the same time. Maryland was kind of getting it from both sides concurrently for a lot of this time period. but in 1632, Lord Baltimore's grant was awarded. And if you're a real stickler, like Lord Baltimore had the first grant, that should have taken the precedence over the preceding grants. But in 1660, Lord Fairfax, which would become the basis of the southern and western border dispute, had his grant. And in 1681, William Penn's grant, which becomes the northern border issue. And you can kind of see that, in this area, this 17 to 1800 area, there's stuff going on both on the southern border and on the northern border. By 1767, the northern border was kind of firmed up with the Mason-Dixon line completed there. Really, the southern border kind of was firmed up, I think, probably, around the 1800s. And that western border still kind of simmered as a dispute until a Supreme Court decision in 1910. And we'll dig into all these details here in the subsequent slides. So looking first at the northern border dispute, as we said, Maryland's original claim went up to this 40th parallel here. And interestingly, Penn's claim in 1681 was bounded on the south by this circle drawn 12 miles around Newcastle. So they created a circle around Newcastle. And where that circle intersects the 40th degree of latitude, you were to draw a straight line, and that would be the southern border. But they were not aware that the 40th parallel did not intersect this circle drawn around Newcastle at a distance of 12 miles anywhere. I think the intent was for this border to be somewhere in here, probably right around where the actual border is. But the fact that these two shapes, this line and this circle, do not intersect, created some issues for a while. So obviously the Penns did not want to lose Philadelphia. That they had established that as their capital and their prime port city. Calvert's, of course, wanted the claim of the 40th parallel as they had been originally promised. There were multiple legal proceedings, a lot of back and forth, and all of these things had to go across the ocean to be settled in courts in England, so that greatly complicated these things. Most of the time, if you wanted really any good action, you had to go in person and represent your case and curry favor with the court and, schmooze and all that kind of stuff. So it really drew these discussions out significantly. While this was all happening in England with all these court cases and everything, and actual armed hostilities broke out with Cressup's War in 1730. Cressup was ostensibly a citizen of Maryland, a resident of Maryland, but settled in Pennsylvania in that disputed area, and through a variety of interesting actions, some armed conflicts, militias from Maryland and Pennsylvania were called in. We're not going to get into the full discussion of that, but just interestingly, an armed conflict did arise due to this border dispute. Lasted for about 8 years. And Thomas Cressup is an interesting guy, kind of one of Maryland's original supporters. And we'll see him again in about 40 years. He plays another role in these border disputes. So while that border dispute was kind of simmering, more legal wranglings were happening, and the Penns were certainly much more aggressive and savvy about promoting what they considered to be their claim. They published and produced this map in 1740 that kind of put out what they thought they thought that they were claiming that Maryland had agreed to this substantially southern border here. Here's that 12-mile circle around Newcastle. Here is a border from the southernmost point of Philadelphia, which I guess would have been the absolute last thing they would have even considered. And here is this kind of established border, or a temporary line that they proposed, and essentially ended up becoming the border. And I have a lot of these maps and sources. You'll find footnoted here in the bottom of the slides. So you can be able to click on these if you go and download the original copy of this presentation. But an interesting piece of propaganda, essentially, by the Penns, who were a lot better about making the case for their claim. And also, it just seems that, especially this Lord Baltimore, but the Lords Baltimore in general, just either were not very savvy about how to pursue their claims or were not very aggressive. And in 1732, so remember this Cresap's War was going on in the colonies. Calvert was in England doing negotiations and court cases, and he unwittingly, inexplicably signed an agreement, essentially giving up that 40th parallel claim and really setting the border where it was today. And many Maryland-based historical sources claim he was tricked. The Penns gave him inaccurate maps and that were labeled incorrectly to reference, and he, signed that agreement in bad faith. But really, Calvert should have known better and been better informed and all of that. And that's really ended up setting that northern border once he agreed to that claim that ended up becoming the border. And in 1767, even though more court cases and all of that were still going on, the Crown mandated that the Mason-Dixon line be set. Mason and Dixon were two Scottish surveyors, so kind of third-party people, and they came in and surveyed that line that we were looking at earlier, and that became the firm border between Maryland and Pennsylvania. So now that had been settled, let's look at the southern border. And the real sticking point on the southern border was the Potomac River, and more specifically the headwaters of the Potomac. That formed the southwestern corner of Calvert's grant. And further complicating this now was that in 1660, Lord Fairfax received a grant from the king that carved out a new strip of land between the Potomac and the Rappahannock River. And that now created a new dispute between Fairfax and the Commonwealth of Virginia, which was south of Fairfax, this claim that Fairfax now had. Fairfax's grant also used that point of the headwaters of the Potomac now as the northwest corner of his territory. And interestingly, there didn't seem to be a lot of dispute between Fairfax and Calvert, but the real dispute seemed to be between Fairfax and the Commonwealth of Virginia. And they had a number of legal proceedings and disputes and all of that stuff. And in 1736, again, a royally mandated surveying commission was established to set those borders, set those points that would establish Fairfax's grant, and by default would also set Maryland's corner. But interestingly, Maryland was never represented in any of these commission surveys or agreements. Really, this dispute was between Fairfax and Virginia, and no one in these subsequent parties was representing Maryland. So in 1736, the first of these survey parties set out. They left from Fredericksburg, Virginia, and again represented Lord Fairfax's concerns and the Commonwealth of Virginia's concerns, but no one from the colony of Maryland. So they were coming from, you see the western panhandle of Maryland here. They were following the Potomac River, and their goal was to, one of the survey parties was to get to the headwaters of the Potomac. Another one was surveying the southern border for the Rappahannock. But we're looking here where they were following the Potomac River, and they came to this point right here, which is around Old Town, Allegheny County area. And this is the confluence of the north branch of the Potomac River, and not labeled, but on the south branch of Potomac River. And the general surveying and land grant guidance is the bigger branch is the prime branch of the river, and that's the one that should be setting boundaries and should be followed. I know this is a modern day map, but in my estimation, it looks like the You could make the case, pretty good case, that the South Branch is a bigger branch. Modern day flow rates, you see that the South Branch is a bigger branch. And when we see on the next map, it drains a substantially larger area and is much longer. But, probably the unspoken rule in this survey party, since they really had no reason to benefit Maryland and every reason to kind of create a larger area for both Fairfax and Virginia, they followed the North Branch. There was also some historical reports that there may have been a big rainstorm to the west here that may have swollen the flow rate of the North Branch. So there were a variety of reasons, but really Maryland had no representation in this, and kind of once they followed this branch, that had really set that as really became the boundary de facto, even though there were a lot of negotiations following on. Good discussion of this, the weather and the geography in this article down here below. This 1736 survey, they were at this point, and they followed what the red here, which is the North Branch. Their goal was to find those headwaters, and they found a point at which they considered the river to start, and made notched a bunch of trees and kind of cleared all the brush in the area, and made it so that area would be recognizable to future surveyors and explorers. That would become the Fairfax Stone. We'll talk about that in the next slide. But that really is, again, something, by default has established that point as the southern and western boundary of Maryland. If they had followed this South Branch, you can see this in blue. It's much longer, drains a bigger area, and would have moved that border down by about 50 miles to the south, probably about 10 miles to the west, and substantially increased that area. Another interesting side note of this survey party is one of Fairfax's surveyors, a guy named John Savage, was part of this trip. And around this point right here, the survey party ran very low on supplies. John Savage offered himself up to be eaten by the party if that was necessary. As it turned out, the supplies arrived in the nick of time. They did not need to eat Mr. Savage, but in honor of his proposed sacrifice, they named the tributary of the river that they were near after him. So the Savage River was named after John Savage, and then subsequently the Savage Mountain and Mount Savage, the town in Allegheny County, were also named after him. So an interesting sidelight on that trip as well. Later on, the disputes continued between Fairfax and the Commonwealth of Virginia, and another surveying commission was started in 1746 to actually survey this line that defined the western border of Fairfax's holdings. And it was the Conway River, the headwaters of the Conway River. It's a tributary of the Rappahannock. That was the southern point down here. And again, that headwaters of the Potomac was the northern point. And a survey departed from here and bushwhacked it remarkably up this line, following it pretty closely. They were able to find that clearing of the notched trees and all of that, and ended up setting a stone at this point with FFX carved into the stone, and that set this point as the Fairfax Stone, which was the boundary of Fairfax's claim, and ended up being the basis for Maryland's border as well. Even though the surveyors and map makers were clearly aware that there was a South Branch, this is labeled the Wappocomo, or the South Branch. It looks pretty big on this map, and you can clearly see that they knew it drained a big area and was very long, but through omission or ignorance, they still continued to adhere to the North Branch. And this detail of this map is from the Fry Jefferson map, which is one of the best early maps of this area, part of the colonies. Lots of great detail, and I recommend checking that one out. It's a really neat map. You can zoom in and get really close and look at all the little tributaries and features that are identified there. But as the country was explored, it did become more and more apparent that this south branch was longer. I think Lord Baltimore was starting to figure this out, and he commissioned good old Thomas Cressup, who was about 70 at this point, to survey the south branch, and it did confirm that this was almost certainly the bigger river and should have been the border. Lord Baltimore tried to get Fairfax to agree to this and set the south branch as the border, and essentially that would have benefited him because it would have shifted everything to the south at the expense of Virginia. But a big event kind of came up in a few years, the Revolutionary War, that put that negotiation on the back burner. And then the issue became not the colony of Maryland, but the state of Maryland's problem to deal with. And after the war, they had lots of veterans they needed to pay off who had fought in the war, and the agreed upon method was to give them land in western Maryland, what would become Garrett County, as payment for their service in the war. A Colonel Francis Deakins was appointed to do the survey, and he surveyed these lots. And really what ended up sealing the borders probably permanently is that he did use that Fairfax stone as the basis for the western border. Again, a very cool old map. This is a map made from Deakins' survey. And it shows all, you can see little grids of military lots that he surveyed. What we're interested in for this presentation is, here's the Fairfax stone, and if you zoom in and you read what's labeled along here, it says the meridian line from the head of the North Branch, the Potomac River, as fixed by Lord Fairfax. So he's essentially putting down that this is the western border of Maryland at this point. He doesn't survey any lots past there. These are all stay to the east of that line. So this essentially becomes the western border. There were some problems with how Deakins surveyed it, so there'll be some fixes along the line, but that's essentially firms it up as the western border. But that still did not stop the contention completely. And again, the ownership of the problem transferred again from Virginia to West Virginia when West Virginia became a state in 1863. And now it was their conflict to deal with. And in 1901 even, this was still a disputed area because Maryland had at that point commissioned another survey, the Brown-Bower survey, claiming that what they labeled as the Potomac Stone was the true headwaters of the river. And really, again, that was probably the case. The Fairfax Stone, this is a smaller, you can barely even tell this is a waterway most of the time. And this is a stronger stream starting at the Potomac Stone. So if you were really a stickler, you would probably consider that the Potomac Stone was the true source of the river, and using all of those original grants, that's where the border should be. So even in 1901, there was a disputed zone here between the border as defined by the Fairfax Stone and what Maryland's claim of the Potomac Stone should be the border, should move it over a good bit to the west. And essentially in 1910, the Supreme Court said, yeah, that's probably a good argument, but possession is 9/10 of the law. This has been the border for so long. Everyone has relied on this. Even Deakins used it. So this is the border. And they essentially erased this claim, and now the border of Maryland and West Virginia is here with some adjustments made to the kind of sloppily done Deakins line. But that set that border now and where the modern day borders are. So it looks, throughout all of these proceedings and negotiations and conflicts, really seems like Lord Baltimore dropped the ball on the Lords Baltimore, many Lords Baltimore throughout this whole history just did not pursue their claim. I think they kind of took it for granted, of what their claim was, and didn't do a lot to aggressively set what should be theirs according to the original claim from the king. And the Fairfax and Penns were a lot more aggressive, and they kind of ended up setting those boundaries to Maryland's disadvantage. But just for fun, I did look at what Garrett County could have been in the purple border here. So again, it would have been the 40th parallel in the north, and following the most advantageous, let's see, that would have been the west fork of the south branch of the Potomac, following those headwaters. That would have set that western boundary. And just for ease of doing this, I followed the current eastern border of Garrett County down to this tip. I'm sure if all of this had actually been Maryland, this would have been divided up a little bit differently, and probably even 2 or 3 counties here. But it was just fun to see what the total expanse of Garrett County could have been. As it turns out, I'm pretty darn happy with what we got. We got a lot of great stuff in Garrett County. Everything kind of has turned out well. You can get to one side of the county and the other and visit the whole area easily. And I think we got a pretty good deal in the end. But never trust a Penn or a Fairfax. They're always looking to steal your land, and be on the prowl, or be on the aware of them if there are any around. But I hope you enjoyed this. It was fun to put together. It's just interesting to kind of dive down the rabbit hole sometimes and think about things that could have been. I'd love to hear your comments or questions. You can reach me at the email or phone number there. If you're interested in maps of the area, I've produced a number of good poster maps of Garrett County, Deep Creek Lake, and all the towns. Some great fold-up maps of outdoor adventures of the whole county, and Deep Creek Lake specifically. They're waterproof, tear-resistant, tons of great detail. On my website, my personal website, dimesy.com, I have produced a number of videos like this of history and interesting things going on in the area. Encourage you to check those out. And you can sign up for my newsletter there, and I'll send out a monthly collection of these little tidbits and things that are going on in the county. And I'm also a real estate agent in Garrett County. And if you're looking to buy or sell real estate, I'd love a chance to talk to you and see how I can help you out. Even if you're just interested in getting some history on your property, digging back and seeing if you can trace it back to one of those military lots, whatever the case, I'd be happy to talk real estate with you as well. But in the meantime, keep an eye out for those Penns and Fairfaxes, and I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you on my next history or local interest lecture.